Hi guys. I just wanted to talk about the idea of the ego and the metaphysical concept of materialism as an overarching metaphysical view of what reality is. And my contention is to say that materialism and the scientism as an epistemological theory that leads to kind of the materialism as an ontological theory, that this dynamic is actually fundamentally a mirror of the ego structure itself and what the ego does. The ego, as a conceptual structure in consciousness, is attempting to process the world through a model that it has constructed since it was a child, in order that most decisions about what reality is at every moment are basically handled by subconscious mechanisms, and the reality that's presented is then stable, secure, based on very basic ontological assumptions that you just acquired at some point in your youth. That is what the ego is, and as reality doesn't fit in with what that model says, you create more and more elaborate spheres of understanding that are less than or reducible to the dominance of the moment, so that it's basically a material causal atmosphere until you reach the self somehow, and then miraculously there's a unity there of being and consciousness. But some people would even deny that in materialism. They would say that there's no consciousness, there's no will, there's no nothing. We'll not talk about that now, but the idea is that this desire to create a mechanical order itself, to see the world in those terms, is an impulse of the ego to explain phenomenon that in a way that denies them existential responsibility. The world is purely something that comes at you, and you have no responsibility for what it is. And this is a very basic idea that I think is a background metaphysical assumption of most people. The reality is you have control over what it is, insofar as you take responsibility for what it is through your ethical perfection. I mean, this is what reality is. It's about perfecting the self in being so that being can reflect the perfect self. Ultimately, the reflection of the face of God to itself, for itself, is the structure of being. And the ego is just a way to keep that kind of understanding of what's going on out, so that it's all just the dominoes falling towards you. And you are a ridiculously small existential creature. Your existence, and even though you're full of being, it's totally epiphenomenal and maybe not even real. The ego leads to this kind of thinking. The ego wants you dead. It's wanted you dead your whole life. It literally desires your death. You can never live up to the ego because it's ultimately based on basic Jungian, Freudian dynamics about impossibly appeasing archetypal parental figures, some of which you have complicated sexual feelings for. I mean, that's the neurotic haze that hovers above human consciousness, that keeps us in a fallen state of hysteria, essentially. And the ego is basically holding that up. It's propping it up. It props up the desire for your own self-destruction as best it can, because it is too afraid of the alternative. The alternative being your radical perfection, totality, confrontation with the thing itself. The ego hates that. That's much scarier than a void universe that's going to collapse upon you and then you die. That is a very comforting idea compared to the existential commitment that starts to emerge once you realize what is going on. So that's my thoughts today on the structure of materialism as a conceptual structure with the ego itself as a conceptual structure, and that's sort of culture's ego, is what I'm saying. Is materialism as a background ego of the culture is what's going on. I mean, just in people's bones. And, you know, that has that has consequences, very serious consequences for just the way the world is. So think about that. Thank you. Bye-bye.